in Wales. He is the host of Rich Politics, a great political commentator, and has been a consistent critic of Mark Drakeford. Richard, a very good afternoon. I hope you had a great Christmas. So what's the mood in Wales? I can't imagine people are that thrilled with Mr. Drakeford, but perhaps they like these protections.
Well, it's strange, isn't it, Richard? Good to be on the show as well, by the way. And, this time last year, people need to be reminded that Mark Drakeford shut the pubs down. Literally, he told them they could open, but they couldn't sell alcohol, if you remember, and slapped a curfew on at 6 p.m. So pubs were allowed to open last year, but they weren't allowed to sell alcohol.
What sort of pub can't sell alcohol and can't stay open beyond 6 p.m.? That doesn't sound like a pub to me. That sounds like a tea house.
Well, it is. That's because he's a teetotaler. But look, the reality is, it's like a butcher opening and not being able to sell meat. It's just absurd. But this time around, of course, different restrictions, completely out of sync with the evidence. The Welsh Government are yet to publish their evidence, Richard, to show the decisions they've made with any proof whatsoever that it's going to be of any good. We had it with vaccine passports here in November. Back in November, the vote went through the Welsh Parliament here where they introduced them. And I quote Mark Drakeford himself, "We're introducing them to stop the spread of the virus and to keep nightclubs open." Those were his words. And then within a month or so, as we're facing now, nightclubs are now shut here in Wales. And, the talk on the ground, Richard, is a lot of people are fed up and frustrated. They just want to get on with their lives, live with this virus, just as they've done with the flu and the colds over centuries. That's what we've come to now. And this Omicron is such an overreaction from both the Scottish government and here in Wales. And people, quite frankly, have had enough. Now, Boxing Day, traditionally, I go and see my family down in Llanelli, my hometown. I went out with my brother for a pint in my old local pub called the Apple Tree. It's normally packed on Boxing Day. There were 6 people in the pub, Richard. It was absolutely shocking. I spoke to the landlord and he told me take-ins were down by 65%. And there is no financial support for the Welsh Government. They're throwing about 150 million towards the industry, but that is a drop in the ocean when you consider the loss of profits that these companies, these pubs are losing, and the hospitality industry.
And what upsets me so much is that actually, so many people are going to lose their jobs in these pubs, these restaurants, and very, very often, actually, it's younger people who are in the service industry, in the pubs, the restaurants, the clubs, and it's the younger people just out of college, just out of school, just out of university, who are looking for their first or second job, and they're the ones already suffering from these restrictions. They're the ones losing the jobs, losing the income, and in a sense, losing their confidence in their leaders in a nation. I just think it sounds absolutely dire.
Yeah, when Drakeford got a massive, when I say majority, but he got back into power here in Wales, people voted him back in. I think there's a real mood and there's a change in the atmosphere amongst even lifelong Labour supporters here in Wales, and now thinking to themselves, hang on a minute, this is not the kind of government we want to be governed by. And I think people are changing their minds. Another rule that they've brought in here, Richard, which you may be aware of, is that outdoors now to sporting events, only 50 people. And last week in a pub, there were 140 people packed in a pub, and yet only 50 people watching the rugby match or football match, I think it was. I think it was day before yesterday, actually. Correction. They watched the rugby or football indoors, 140 people in a pub, but no more than 50 could watch it outdoors.
So 3 times as many people were in the pub watching the game that only 50 people could watch.
It's crazy.
Outside.
It's crazy. Look, it's laughable. It's laughable, Richard, but it's not the same. It's quite serious because the impact this is having on people's mental health as well, with their socialising part of it. People can't make plans over the new year. Lots of people are talking about going over the Severn Bridge, or Prince of Wales Bridge as it's now known, into Bristol for New Year's celebration. And that's going to have a huge impact on hospitality.
Which makes complete common sense. Why wouldn't you? People are going to... It's the law of unintended consequences. I just find it extraordinary. And you mentioned earlier, and we're going to be talking about it later in the show, about vaccine passports, Richard. So just to help my listeners, you've still got vaccine passports in Wales. You've had them since back in November time. Doesn't sound as though it helped, has it?
But it hasn't worked at all. It doesn't stop the spread of the virus. We all know that, and so does the government themselves. And the idea was to introduce them so people would feel safe when they went out, so we could keep places within the hospitality industry open. And now we shut it. So even his own way of working things out doesn't make any sense whatsoever to the people here in Wales. And even ardent supporters of Mark Drakeford are beginning to question some of his decisions. I've been speaking to a number of staff that work down at the Senedd, and they've been telling me they're scratching their heads down there. They don't know what he's doing. Frankly, I don't think he knows what he's doing, because there was a stage when they said we're following the science. Now, this is no longer the case here in Wales. Mark Drakeford is using his powers, and it's an overreach of power of government into everybody's daily lives. And to me, it's disproportionate, it's wrong, and it should not be happening. He shouldn't have these powers.
So this is the key question, isn't it? As you go into the new year, actually, what's going to happen? What evidence is he going to dream up, summon up, in order to maintain restrictions? Or do you think that actually the public pressure or pressure from other leaders and politicians in the Welsh Assembly will actually force him to lift the restrictions? What are your hopes there?
Well, I'm hopeful, at least the Welsh Conservatives here, slightly different to the Conservative UK government, have really gone against vaccine passports from day one. So the implementation of them was through a botched up vote anyway by Welsh Conservative, funny enough, but they are against it. So we do have some opposition here, Richard, against vaccine passports, which I welcome. The only concern I have is that Welsh Labour are now in collaboration with Plaid Cymru, and it's a coalition. They call it a cooperation. It's not. It's a coalition of Plaid Cymru and Welsh Labour. And so unfortunately, they'll always have a majority when it comes to legislating for things such as vaccine passports and any of the emergency measures they wish to put into place. So I'm not hopeful for any changes there, but we're not alone. There are many of us on the ground here, not just through protests, but there are a lot of industries, the hospitality industry, which we've already mentioned as well, sporting events. We had the CEO of Cardiff City Football Club complaining that this is terrible because on Boxing Day, their games were cancelled. It weren't cancelled, it was indoors only, so behind closed doors. So fans couldn't turn up to watch the game.
I mean, that's the extraordinary thing, because elsewhere in England, fans can go and watch games. They could be watching Welsh teams playing in England. I mean, the whole thing's a complete nonsense. But the loss, the economic hit to those clubs must be absolutely huge. But it sounds to me, Richard, that you're not actually that hopeful that restrictions are going to be eased in the early weeks of the new year. And if that's the case, I would have thought that resentment in Wales of the freedoms that hopefully we're still continuing to enjoy in England could really grow. I mean, I think that's, I'm a fan of devolution, but I think that's incredibly damaging.
Yeah, well, as you know, I'm not a fan of devolution, Richard. You know that. But we agree to disagree. And I think, for the first time in a long time, I'm able to say Boris has done the right thing. It's very rare that you hear me say that, but on this occasion, I can say it, right? Because, look, what we're seeing happening here is more draconian measures by Mark Drakeford. And I do fear they will continue, because he's been doing this without evidence, without the data to back it up. So what's to stop him continuing, Richard? He seems hooked on the idea of locking people down, taking away civil and social liberties. And let's not forget that prior to some of these restrictions, Mark Drakeford wanted a full lockdown. He was asking the UK Treasury for money. He was asking Rishi Sunak for more furlough money. And as soon as it was said to him, look, it's not available, he then tweaked his little restrictions to minor issues that we're facing now, 6 at a table and 30 indoors and all the kind of stuff they're talking about now. So Drakeford, really, for some reason, I don't know what's in this guy's mind. I can't get my head around it. What political advantage is there? Well, there's no financial advantage. I don't understand why he's doing it. And so a lot of people feel the same.
Well, maybe it's actually two issues, Richard. Maybe it's that sort of, power goes to people's heads. So maybe it is that sort of control over people's lives. But also, and I think this is what's going on in Scotland as well, actually, I think the money does talk. And I think they will be using this as a negotiating lever to get more money out of Westminster. And again, I think this is really divisive, where if that happens, whether it's money going from Westminster to Scotland or Westminster to Wales, you've then got a situation where actually you're going to have people in England resenting more money going to Wales, more money going to Scotland. And again, that actually is very divisive at a time when, as a nation, we actually need to be pulling together as the United Kingdom. We need to be pulling together. We need to be looking forward to the new year. And we need to be putting the foot flat on the accelerator of recovery, of growth, of motivation, of confidence. And none of that seems to be coming.
No. Well, I was, at the start of this pandemic, I was calling for a four-nation approach. I mean, it was so confusing, as we've seen the last 2 years, Richard, with different rules here in Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and England. And what should have happened, and I know it hasn't happened for political reasons, which is a real shame, because they say it's a public health emergency, but if it was that serious, then surely they could get their heads on the table. And Mark Drakeford has used it here as a political football, really, against Boris Johnson, the Conservative government, to try and score political points. And I think that's a crying shame, because they could have worked together, made the rules much simpler, much easier for everyone to understand. Although I don't agree with restrictions or lockdowns, I don't believe they've worked. It's my personal opinion, of course.
Sure.
And I think it's had a devastating impact. And the long-term impact of this, Richard, when a public inquiry is held, is going to show the state of people's mental health, the loss of businesses, the loss of life as well. We've report this morning from one of the Welsh media outlets here stated that a young person died because they didn't get diagnosed with a brain tumour early enough, and the operation was cancelled. And it's just terrible.
There are so many implications of these continuing restrictions, which are so divisive, so damaging. Richard Taylor, thank you so much for those thoughts about what's going on in Wales.